Good evening. My name is Evelyn Hankins, and I'm the Senior Curator at the Hirshhorn. Thank you for joining me this evening for a conversation with Charles Gaines, which is part of the museum's weekly artist program series, Talking to Our Time. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to extend my deepest gratitude and acknowledgement to the Nacotchik or Anacostan and Piscataway people, whose ancestral land is where we at the Hirshhorn Museum join you from. CART captioning and American Sign Language interpretation are provided for tonight's program, and the details about both are in the chat. Additionally, the captioned recording of this program will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel. In an expansive art practice developed almost over 50 years and across a broad array of media, Charles Gaines has employed rule-based processes and systems to interrogate forms of representation and the way meaning and value are attributed to art. His densely layered, series-driven artworks, which explore the interplay and tensions between rational thought and the subjective imagination, have established him as a pivotal figure in conceptual art. Rather than try to summarize his extraordinary professional trajectory, I'll note that he recently opened shows at Dia Beacon and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and that he spearheaded the creation of a new fellowship supporting Black MFA students at Cal Arts, where he has taught since 1989. Charles, would you please turn your camera on? Hello, you went off my screen. Thank you welcome. And thank you again for agreeing to talk with us this evening. It is really great and to have you here, and also a real privilege. If we could bring the slideshow up. I would like to start with what is a relatively early work that the Hirshhorn was fortunate enough to acquire a few years ago. It's called Walnut Tree Orchard number 13. And this is a series that you started in 1974. Each iteration in the series is a triptych. It comprises a black and white photograph of a walnut tree, as we see here, and then 2 gridded drawings. The first uses numbers to plot the tree on the grid. And then the second uses different colors to map all the trees thus far in the series. If we could go to the next slide. And then just as an example of how the series builds, this is number 14 in the series, which the Hirshhorn also owns. It's emblematic of some of the core elements at the heart of your practice, using known objects mediated by grids, numbers, and systems to evade creative expression, and working in a series where everything kind of builds upon each other rather than just having this series of discrete objects. And I think most importantly, it's an exploration of the tree as a sign rather than as in subject matter. This isn't about landscape or a genre of landscape. So starting with these early works, could you talk a little bit about what propelled you into a conceptual practice and specifically why the grid became so central to it?
Sure. Evelyn, I'll give you the short version.
Okay.
Centuries ago when I was in graduate school, I found that I went into a painting program at the Rochester Institute of Technology, but I found that that I didn't have much attachment to the strategies of art making and strategies of painting making at the time, but art making in general is based upon the creative imagination, which essentially meant to me that you stood in front of a blank canvas and imagined something and you would paint it. I know it's a more complicated narrative than that because you're informed and influenced by both your environment and your training, but essentially you're called to pull up something from a source that didn't actually exist. And so this is to say that I didn't have much problem in general with this idea of making art, but it wasn't meaningful to me because I had the feeling that that whatever I imagined felt arbitrary. That is that it didn't seem really pivotal or really, important to any particular moment or event going on in my life. And so I thought that I would do some investigation, do some research, and try to expand the whole idea of what making art's about. And in doing that, I ran into 2 sources. Well, one was a book by Henri Faucion called The Life of Forms in Art. The other was a book by Ajit Mukherjee called Tantra Art. And in Tantra art, I discovered that there are strategies of making art that didn't involve the creative imagination. And yet these strategies, these objects were still called works of art. And I got the idea that this more global investigation to art practice might be useful for me because actually it was through Tantra art that I really noticed what it was that I had problems with. And the other was this book called Life of Forms and Art by the foremost art historian, Refusal. And Faucion wrote that book in order to try to describe what it was to do art history. And one of the pivotal things he said in there was that the role of the art historian is to recreate the moment of a work of art. And expanding on that, he discovered that moment is chock full of a lot of things, a lot of cultural and social and conceptual things that happen around you that contribute to whatever mark you make to that moment, not just your creative imagination. And the book was about, tracking those various things that influenced the making of a work of art. And he's in respect to art history, he thought that, this is really important because art historians should be aware of these various sources of a work of art, not just be aware of schools and styles.
Right.
And I thought that it was interesting to me because in one aspect he talked about some notion of those, and talking about those notions that are outside the realm of one's sort of subjectivity. I really focused in this area where he said that matter had its own volition that is not informed or not influenced by the intent of the artist, that it has as much to say about a work of art as the artist has. So I was interested in saying that, well, how do I trap that thing that I'd isolated that was not that was outside the creative imagination? How can I focus that in terms of making a work of art? And then a year or two later, I discovered Hannah Darboven, New York. She had this exhibition in 3 galleries. It was 2 galleries in MoMA, where she had her idiosyncratic practice. And one of the things that, to make a long story short, I discovered the grid. I mean, Hannah's work is very different from mine, but I discovered repetition and redundancy. And through that, I discovered, the grid. And from that, I discovered mathematics. And this all congealed at a time when I was driving down a highway in Fresno, California, where I was teaching at the time, and saw a walnut tree orchard. And, Darboven and Faucion and Tantra, it sort of all came together when I was looking at this orchard, because I saw hundreds and hundreds of walnut trees, all the same species, but each one different from each other. And and immediately I got this idea of the comparing, these different trees that formed this one single concept, but was infinite in its representation. And so what if I was able to chart those differences? And that the math part came in, because then I thought that if I sort of overlap all the trees in your Walnut Tree Orchard, they would produce that act of overlapping them, or act of charting them, was itself a metonymic activity that is not an activity determined by my imagination, but nevertheless made what's called artistic marks, even if they are numbers and colors. And where it came down was that my single issue was the relationship between the creative imagination and the mark that constitutes the body of a work of art. And rather than saying that mark was made by the creative imagination, I thought I could say that this mark was made by a system. Notwithstanding the fact that I created the system.
Right.
That's another argument. We can get involved in that, over, I was saying over a martini, but
yeah, sounds good.
But I thought that I could say that a system can produce figures that causes the viewer to have the same response to it that the tropes of the creative imagination is supposed to be responsible in causing, and I can say that was not responsible in causing.
So how do you, the series has been ongoing. It's extended on. How do you decide when the series was complete? Was it predetermined at the beginning of the series when it was complete? Because thinking about the creative imagination, I think of how I look at all of those trees overlapped in different colors, which I know stand as difference rather than as expression and creative expression of the artist. And that's that whole choice thing in there again. But when did you know when the series is complete? How was that decided?
Well, I knew that, to the mathematical component of it, I knew that I was involving an open system. There are closed systems and open systems, like SolidWorks deals with closed systems, permutations. Right. And I knew I was involved with an open system. So the ending of open system is arbitrary. I mean, they go on infinitely, they go on until you exhaust the numbers of trees that exist in the universe. And so you end it arbitrarily. So I decided to end it by through the alphabet. So there are 27 trees in the series.
Only 26 letters in the alphabet.
Yeah.
Okay, plus one.
Plus one, yes.
Plus one. I know we have other works to talk about, but I think one thing that I think is interesting is I think in the last few years, you've begun to thought of this as a social critique, not just about representation. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, yes. I discovered, again, this is a long story that I have to make short.
Okay, well, I don't want to drag you down a rabbit hole, but.
Yeah. Well, keep your eye on me. When you see when you see me sinking, grab me. Okay. So but one important question was asked for me after I started working in systems, by some Black artists in New York, and he asked me, "Why are you making white art?" And I never thought that I was making white art, but I thought it was interesting because it was a conceptualist practice, and white artists created conceptual art, and there was this discourse going on because of civil rights movement and Black Power movement about how representation works in works of art, and that you have this responsibility to your culture to reflect on the specificity of your culture. And I always thought that I was doing that, but I didn't know how to say it. And so, I mean, the short story is that although it was a question I couldn't answer at the time, I thought it was a profound question I needed to answer. And so I came up with an answer a decade later that might seem more like a justification than an answer, but for me, it reflected my interest in critical analysis, critical thinking, that I was interested in the issues of representation that fed the ability to think critically. And this happened because I think that this happened because I was raised in the Jim Crow South. And one of the earliest questions that my mom told me that I was asking is like, why, are white people so mean to Black people, and so, why can't I drink at that fountain? Why can't I sit in the front of the bus? I remember going on a bus with my aunt, and I sat in the front seat. My aunt grabbed me by the arm and said, "Get back here, Frankie." That was my family name is Frankie. Get back. It was back there. And I said, "Why do I have to get back here?" So she dragged me back there, and I was wondering, like, who set these rules? I mean, why does this have to exist? And so, in many ways, I wasn't asking for sociological answers. I was asking for epistemological, ontological answers. Like, why does this exist in the world? And so I figured that even though I was like 5 years old at the time, that somehow I think probably I was having these ontological thoughts, but particularly with respect to social and cultural issues of race. And so the answer to my question to my friends about that in terms of my interest in representation, so I use like conceptual tropes to interrogate. People call me conceptual artist, and I embrace that term. But what was different from me is that I wasn't interested in these processes, many of them didactic or metonymic, in order to push the idea of art. I was interested in them in order to push the idea of representation. And first generation conceptualism thought representation was bad. So they were trying to transcend the issues of representation. And I thought, and I knew that I wasn't doing that. I was trying to figure out how through the figures we find in works of art, how do we manage to get to a point of those figures being meaningful? And I saw that as directly linked to my questions about race in the South, where the tropes of representation was white and black, and signs that said you can or can't drink here, or you can or can't eat here. Those were the figures that I was interested in, and I was trying to think about, what brought these things into existence. And so I realized that my interest in mathematics was the kind of strategy of deconstructing representation to get to these sources where you can make a case that you bring your own experience to representation, and the politics of those experiences can be revealed in these kinds of structuralist and strategies of making.
Right. Well, it's interesting because you actually just inadvertently answered my second question, which was to talk about what kind of the challenges of being a Black conceptual artist in the 70s, because you were between these two realms. There was the racism of the mainstream art world, and then there were the demands of that Black artists would make works that represented their life. So I'm going to elide over that and kind of go on to the next slide if we could. On that same topic, over the years, you've curated a number of really important exhibitions, many of them which have really pointed to the ongoing marginalization of Black artists. A few years ago, you created a show of Terry Atkins' art, which, in the fact that it was a revelation to a lot of artists, showed how he had been marginalized because he's so important. I'd like to go back a few decades to this show. It's called The Theater of Refusal, Black Art and Mainstream Criticism, which is a show that you organized in 1993 with, I think, Catherine Lord at UC Irvine. It included 11 African-American artists, many of whom we know now: David Hammonds, Gary Simmons, Adrian Piper. And alongside each artwork, you hung or displayed published text discussing their work. And it pointed directly to the way that the biases of art institutions and critics and curators resulted in rhetorical strategies that reinforced racial stereotypes and regulated difference. I mean, this was a moment, 1993, when racial bias was front and center, both in the broader culture because of Rodney King, but also because of Thelma Golden's Whitney Biennial, which was so important. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit about the curatorial strategies and also in the reading room, which I think is a really important part of the show. It's actually not an important part, it's an integral part of it. But I'm also interested to hear about the critical reactions to it.
Sure. It's a show. The idea of the show came to me in 1989, and actually in late '89, I had selected the artists who participated and tried to find someone interested in taking out the show. I couldn't. I mean, it took almost 40 years to find an institution that was interested. It's Catherine Lord at Irvine.
Imagine.
When I introduced the idea to her, she immediately picked up on it and took the ball running, which I appreciated. But it was generally, and maybe this is an interesting show or not, but I don't want to presume too much. But I think that the resistance that I had was that people just thought the subject wasn't interesting. And that so not that nobody knew who Charles Gaines is and what's he doing trying to organize a show. Of course, the subject wasn't interesting. Yeah.
Which suggests that it actually is interesting, by the way.
Oh, thank you. And it happened because I was just reading, doing my reading of art periodicals, and it just clicked on me. There's only a few Black artists being written about in those days.
Right.
There are a lot of Black artists, believe me. That you know now, because now many of those people have taken center stage, but they were around in 1980. They were around in 1970, and but nobody was being written about, or very few. And so I noticed that when they were written about, the writing was stereotypical. Like Basquiat was the wild child, and Adrian Piper was trying to play off of something that she really wasn't. That, I mean, people didn't understand couldn't understand that why Adrian Piper would call herself black when she didn't look black, and even if she could prove being black, the problem was again that she didn't look black. So whatever she was saying was just not true, and this played into a critique of their practice. The stereotyping played into a critique of their practice. In terms of Basquiat, of course, it got him he got a lot of attention, but it's clear that in watching his life, it was a struggle. With Piper, it was the source of people ignoring her work. Right. But I noticed that the stereotyping was a central feature, whether it's positive stereotype in terms of Basquiat or negative in terms of Piper, or Lorna Simpson, who, the writers said that they couldn't understand her work because she was working in some secret black code. And these are actually things that were written and they're documented in the catalog. So I thought this would be interesting to expose because it would go far in explaining something that was on the plate at the time, that Black people just couldn't get exhibitions. So this would demonstrate that the reason they couldn't get exhibitions is because they were marginalized. So I wanted to sort of unpack that marginalization and analyze the strategies of marginalization. And that was what the show is about. There is one aspect of it that I didn't think about. That is that the show is a kind of a survey, but it's a survey about artists who have in common, their work being victimized by strategies and art writing strategies of marginalization, rather than some concept in the work that bridges them together.
Right.
And so that expansion allowed the book room was Catherine Lord's idea, allowed the book room to organically grow out of the idea of the installation and be accepted both as a kind of installation itself and as a kind of library, sort of a functional space as well as a conceptual space where we just collected all the periodicals, the magazines and sources that I researched and pulling out all of these articles, along with some titles were having to do with the idea of race and art, and put them in one location in the gallery, and people would treat it as a reading room. In fact, it was called the reading room. That I thought was interesting because usually such a room would be seen as not intrinsic part of an exhibition. But in this case, I felt very comfortable that the reading room, the books, and the wall text, which featured specific quotes of marginalization that were found in my research, I felt that they functioned as works of art also. It's not difficult to see that now. I mean, right?
Right. Well, that's 30 years of reflection. Yeah, it's easy. Yeah. It's actually obvious, actually. So what was the critical reaction? Irvine, did you get pressed? And if you did, I know it traveled too. I think it came to the University of Maryland. What kind of press and criticism did you get? Or did people respond?
Well, all the artists thought it was really cool. Right?
That's all that really matters.
But there was some writing around it, and not much, but most of it accused me of, I guess it's kind of victimization. What we would call today is victimization strategy. And I remember one review, who sort of denied what I was claiming, that their choice of exhibition and choice of artists had to do with the quality of the work. And I said that you can't, and I was suggesting you can't deal with this as a quality through the lens of marginalization. So they were critical of me for saying that, but it was interesting because the periodical that they wrote around that featured 3 Black exhibitions, and it was during Black History Month. And so the fact that they saw the work in the first place,
so unconscious,
legitimized by So they weren't even aware. I mean, it's like this thing that I get today where now people comment on a more sort of diverse environment of exhibition of people of color and women. But then and this is particularly happening during these discussions of deaccessioning, there is this art history that left Black people out, and it's very difficult to write Black people into that history. I mean, some places are having difficulty doing that, you know, like making Norman Lewis part of the evolution of abstract expressionism, for example. And so I would accuse, and some of these writers are alive today, and I told them that, you know, that the problem is, you know, especially if you find it a problem to challenge who the grand masters were in the 50s and 60s, the problem was that, you know, they were operating in a privileged space, you know, a reduced competition. And then there would have been more people of color in there if you had written about them, and you did not write about them.
Right, Greenberg specifically, among others, Greenberg and Rosenberg.
But like all of them.
Yeah, they didn't write.
I mean,
yeah,
Greenberg specifically, but even, you know, the weekly, the monthly articles that would come out, and even that whenever there is an exhibition of a minority artist, and I tried to show that in the show, that you didn't write about it, or you wrote about it in dismissive ways, maybe thinking you were saying good things, but nevertheless the language was marginalizing. And so by doing that, you know, Clifford Still didn't have much competition. Now Clifford Still is a great artist. I mean, I think he is. I mean, I love Clifford Still, but it's like saying that. Like saying that this is the concrete art history where all these white male artists are there and their positions can't be challenged. And I think they all can be challenged because they had the privilege of making art in an environment that privileged them and under or deprivileged anybody else, artists of color and women.
Well, I mean, it's a kind of a segue, but not really into talking about the next work, because it's thinking about how quality is determined by cultural and social factors. It's this kind of, you know, it's this thing that's determined by whoever has the power of writing, right? And then that writing is diffused into the air, into the ether, and then everybody else kind of picks it up. So what I'd like to do, if we could go to the next slide, is look at a work called Manifesto Three. This is from a series of manifestos that you started in, I think, 2008. And they are all multimedia works that are a direct outgrowth of your own musical training, because you were, I think, a professional drummer, or if not a professional, right up there. Each manifesto features music that was produced by a system that translates text into music. And I'm going to let you explain that in a second. But I think what the key of it is how the resulting music produces a sound experience that sounds as if it was constructed subjectively to produce certain affects, but it wasn't. Instead, the series again highlights how listeners, or we all, make particular connections and meanings because of our cultural learning and experiences. Again, it's that, you know, what we've been trained to think about. So if you could talk about the series and the translation system more broadly, but then with a particular eye towards Manifesto Three, because we do have some details of both the drawing, and then we have an excerpt that we'd like to show. So if you could talk about these works.
Yes, Manifesto Three represents a period in my work that I call the text image period, the other than the grid work. But my interest is still the same. I wanted to produce an art work or an art object that contains emotive power, you know, but wasn't produced by what's called creative imagination. That it wasn't produced by my subjectivity. At least the tropes the figures that you're looking at weren't products of my subjectivity. But nevertheless, you respond to it as if the work, that your responses were the effect that is often assumed is produced by what we call the poetic translation into the real world of your subjectivity. So it's part of my general critique of the Enlightenment project, having to do with notions of genius and the unconscious and the role of subjectivity and unconscious and within the in terms of modernism, the way modernism articulated these things. So what I did was that I wanted to translate a text into music notation, and then by playing them together, showed that they would have a motive power, but then realized that the way that the piece was constructed was completely arbitrary, that it was absent my intention. And so you're left with the question, well, where did the meaning come from? Because there wasn't this mysterious translation from an invisible imagination poetically becoming real in the world, and the assumption that the power and the meaning comes from that translation. So if that's not the case, then the question is, where did it come from? So the first thing I have to convince is create a situation where you're convinced that there is meaning in the work, that what you interpret seems meaningful, it doesn't seem arbitrary. But then to deal with the paradoxical information that it was arbitrarily constructed. And by putting these two things together, I thought I would form my critique. So essentially what I did was that I would select a political text. In the early forms, there were texts that were archival documents that I called manifestos. In some cases, the text writers called these manifestos. And so I selected a section of the text and would translate the letters to musical notes. The translation was the letters A through G in the alphabet. It translates to the notes A through G. And I translated the letter H to B flat because it might be surprising to you that this whole strategy of translation, I didn't invent. Somebody beat me to it 500 years ago. So B flat was attributed to Bach. And so I used the B flat translation in this piece. I would translate it in terms of a piano piece with voice. And so if you can go to the next slide, I think because you're close up. Yeah. So you can see that there's in that staff, there's a voice at the top line, and then there's the piano line underneath. So that's the translation. And if you stood in front of the actual drawings, and these are drawings that were made from the musical manuscripts that I produced. If you look closely, you can actually see that I'm not lying, that actually I did translate the notes. And so we get melodies that are produced by the text. These melodies were accompanied by chords that itself were determined by a system. And then this manuscript was given to in this work to Sean Griffin, who's a composer, to write an arrangement for ensemble. And Sean was given the direction that he had to follow the sequence of chords. He couldn't add a note. He couldn't subtract a note. He could do in rhetorical flourishes, like he can play a note soft or he can play it loud, but he couldn't change anything. And so he wrote a composition for the ensemble that is attached to a monitor. And you saw in the previous slide that there was a monitor with text on it. So you would go into the installation, you see the drawings, and you see this monitor with scrolling text. And the text is the scroll of the political manifesto that I chose and the music that it produced.
Right, and let's play the video in just a second. But just to clarify, this is number 3. So this is just for piano, and that was a change from some of the earlier ones, which were orchestrated. Is that correct? Just so I make sure I have it straight in my mind.
Yes, I'm glad you reminded me of that, because I actually used the first piece where I wrote the arrangement myself.
And why did you just stay with piano? Why did you, to scale it back, or you could make this argument that having someone come in and orchestrate it was adding in that, creative expression that you're trying to elide. So
yeah, see, this is the problem, because we don't have 2 hours for us to explore what you just said.
well, I think you
no,
probably, I
there-
wouldn't take very long. You could surely probably just pull me right in. So
well, the issue is that you don't take the act of choice away.
right.
That choices are made not from the imagination, but by the terms given to you by the system. So
Right.
like, for example, you can play chess. There's an infinite number of moves in chess. But you don't call each move an expression.
No, you're right. They're a choice. Okay.
Yeah, they're a choice.
No,
So,
I understand that, but I think that's a really important part of your practice, and it's a fine point that's critical for people to understand. And with some of the more recent work, it seems particularly critical. Well, why don't we play the video and we'll play this excerpt from Manifesto 3. So I was saying earlier when we were talking before the program started that I tested this out on my teenager, and it turned into a whole discussion about how we produce meaning. But one of the questions is how do you decide what text to use and what text to juxtapose? Again, these are choices, but can you talk about how you decided to juxtapose James Baldwin and Martin Luther King in this one, in the specific text that you chose? Like how, and part of me wants to know, does he test it out? Do you transcribe it and translate it out and then listen to it?
well, no, well, the choice is essentially arbitrary. You know, I've collected an archive of political texts, you know, literally hundreds of political texts, and that I think that fits the project, and that from which I can choose if I do a piece. And the choice of text really has to do with whatever is interesting me at the time. I don't think about the relationship. In fact, it's very important that I don't, because what's core to my practice, especially with the which is true in the grid work, but especially true in the text image work, is that the elements that the subjects that I bring together are clearly arbitrarily related. That they don't, so that you can't trace in their selection a pathway back to my subjectivity. And so within the body of choices, you know, they're really a function of the moment of the choice. They're not designing, or I'm not imagining a particular meaning between the you know, Baldwin and Martin Luther King. But yeah, I do have a general subject, which is the issue of race and the political subject. So that has the same kind of framing that the grid has in the grid work. So you can make that correlation. You can see that as a property of the system that I developed, just like so you can see how I chose to have letters of the alphabet, the translation from letters of the alphabet to musical notes. And I should say, I also made the choice that those letters in the alphabet that are not used in musical notation are produced as silent beats or rests. And these are choices I make in order to form the system. But there isn't a way of tracking or tracing or a kind of metonymy or cause and effect between the choices I make and the results that you hear, which is very different from the way we normally, regard works of art. And so essentially, this is what I followed here.
Great. We'll get back to your art in just a second, though I know we have questions, but I want to talk a little bit about your teaching. You've taught consistently since the late 1960s in Fresno, and then you've been at CalArts since 1989. And there are a lot of artists out there, both those we know like Sam Durant and Mark Bradford and Andrea Bowers, and many who are not so familiar to us, who have spoken about how your class, Form and Content, which is not a traditional studio class when we think about an MFA program, revolutionized their practice. So could you talk about your commitment to teaching and why you think that Form and Content has had such an impact? And then I'd love to have you talk a little bit about the fellowship program that you spearheaded that ensured that there were scholarships for Black students at CalArts.
I always have trouble with that question. It's hard for me to take a special responsibility, even considering the content form class, with what happened to these particular artists that you mentioned. To me, it's like I just taught at a good art school. I mean, it's really it is a good art school.
It's a great art school.
Yeah, and we get really good students, and I'm the beneficiary of getting really good students. And to that degree, it's like, claiming some responsibility. There's like me, the fact that if I'm living in New York and I think about all of the great people New York produced, and I claim responsibility because I was living in the same city.
Okay, all right. Well, they all attribute a lot of credit to you.
I know they do. So I don't know. Yeah, I know they do.
I know, but what I love is that there was one. I think it was a round table or something, or one artist was telling a story. It was like Sam Durant talking about Mark Bradford and how they would walk out of the class and were like, I have no idea what he said, and totally mystified. But then they went home and worked on it for a little while. But so talk about this fellowship program that I think you basically spearheaded the fundraising to ensure that there was an endowment for fellowships for Black students at CalArts, and it was announced last fall, but it was a major lift, spearheading the fundraising for such an endowment. We all know that. So could you talk about this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I started teaching at CalArts in 1989, and I noticed that it was not a very diversified environment. And part of the reason we discovered that is because it's a very expensive school, and it was hard for us to attract students from diverse populations, particularly Black students and Latino students, in order to, and even at least be the equivalent of the population, of minority population in Los Angeles, let alone the world, and it's pretty much it was money. So for a long time, Sam, when he joined the faculty, joined me in this. We tried to get a scholarship program for minority students, and we met all kinds of resistance. It's interesting because there is this sort of what I call some kind of some liberal framing where everybody recognized the problem and everybody's totally sympathetic toward the problem, but nobody wanted to do anything about the problem that was concrete. In fact, roadblocks were put in front of it. So for all those years, Sam and I failed, and Colleen Smith joined the faculty, and she tried to do it. And at the time, I was on leave, and she ran into the same roadblocks. So at a certain point, I don't know why it came to me that, well, I mean, it looks like the only way this will get scholarship to get started is if I contribute the money. And so I did. I went to the school and said, okay, I'll donate enough money to support 2 scholarships a year if the school would come back with matching funds, so that we would have a scholarship program with 4 students. And we had a really great president who said, yeah, I'll take your challenge. And they did match the funds. In fact, they better than that because of a couple of generous people being on the board, Joe Kraus and even David Kordansky, who was my student at Cal Arts, contributed serious amounts of money so that we have now a permanent scholarship program. And it took a year to do this. And whereas I was looking at the prior 30 years, and I said, you know, like, what happened? Why is it different? And I have to say that the times are different today, probably because of it's you know, a whole new generation of people who have come on the scene, but also because it's been proven so thoroughly that the negative effects of environments that are not diverse. I mean, the consequence of the environments that are diverse is as serious as people getting killed. And so there was sympathy there from certain corners, and I and I attribute, therefore, you know, Black Lives Matter and the Innocent Project, I can't remember the name of it, but the Innocence Project, and various organizations like this for helping to shape and change the thinking of people to believe that it's an imperative to do that it is not reverse discrimination to pay attention to the fact that people of color are underprivileged, and something needs to be done to try to, you're not going to equal the playing field, but something is to be done in order to level it to some degree, at least so that we get more, for example, at Cal Arts, more Black students in the program.
And so has it started? Is this the first year? Has it already started, or is the fellowship program going to go into place when you accept students for next fall?
From what I understand, because I'm not a part of the choice, you know.
Right.
Some people think there's a conflict of interest, but from what I understand, they've selected the first 2 Black students, because the students is available to Black and Hispanic students from Mexico or Central America.
Great. Well, I applaud your efforts, because grad school is really expensive, and Cal Arts is an amazing school. So I applaud it. I am getting the international signal that I'm supposed to open it up for a couple questions. We had hoped to look at more art, but hopefully this program will encourage people to look at more art. I want to just look in the Q&A really quick. There's a comment here from Teresa Espana. I'll just say this, Charles. It says, a comment: Charles's content-informed class at Fresno State transformed the intellectual lives of non-artists too. So that's someone back from Fresno State remembering your class. It's not just your Cal Art students.
Yeah, I remember her.
Well, I'm glad that she was able to tune in tonight. So there's a question here from Gustavo Rincon for Professor Gaines. Please discuss your role as a researcher of systems in the current times of art, science, and mathematics in the age of AI. What are the systems in place in our current institutions that should be critiqued to aid in our continual evolution for equality in our global society? And how has your role as an educator aided your research and your conceptual art investigation? It's a big question.
Yeah, well, I think that technology is being increasingly used as a tool to extend, the power of capitalism, you know, and so as a discipline or as a cultural artifact, the technology it really, I mean, you would think that it would reinforce the idea of democracy, but it's contributing, in the way it's being used now, it's contributing very little to the development of the idea of humanity. And there's no reason for that. Now, one of the things that I always make the point of saying is that my interest in mathematics and arithmetic is essentially unrelated to the tropes of IA and so forth, because I'm using those strategies as a critical tool. And to the degree that, you know, when I started working with the grid, I called the square, I called the structure of the grid a buildup of symmetrical buildup and repetitive buildup of squares or cells. But now they want to call it what do you call it? A digitized image. In other words,
pixelated.
Yeah,
pixelated.
And the problem, I don't have a general problem with that, but what worries me about thinking that I'm working in pixels is that it attaches it to this I think problematic use of what we can generally call digital systems, and rather than in my interest in using it as a sort of a structuralist tool to unpack culture. And I think that to that degree, I mean, I don't work in this field, but I think that there's room for that. For there's a lot of room for rethinking the use, particularly, you know, some of the serious humanistic questions that artificial intelligence introduces, to rethink about how this stuff should be deployed. I think that focus on products and capital is encouraging the idea of developing in this sort of a humanistic direction. But I think all those things can be refocused, and I haven't seen anybody doing it yet. But that's what I think. I think in and of itself, it's not bad.
No, I mean, I don't see it happening, but maybe this pandemic will refocus. That's what we I think all keep helping. We've got a couple more questions on here. From Ellen Tanney, I'm still thinking about the descriptor of your work as quote unquote white art. And you mentioned that it was Black artist friends who interpreted your work this way. But did white audiences also do so in the 1970s and 80s?
I love that question. Like, they didn't know I was Black.
Right.
And when the circumstances, times they found out, they were quite upset. They didn't know what to do with me. In fact, I think I told Ellen this story, that I was in this exhibition up at Dartmouth. It was a traveling exhibition, so Dartmouth was one of the places I went. And so nobody knew I was Black. So I went to the opening, and I was introduced as Charles Gaines. And just my introduction caused a stir. Apparently, what happened was that they didn't know how to treat me at the opening. And so when the opening was closing, everybody was going out to the typical dinner after art openings and to have their martinis. Why am I saying martinis so much? But anyway, to have their martinis. And the curator of the director of the museum came up to me at Dartmouth. This is in 1979, all right? This was not in 1850. He said that, I'm so happy you came to the show, but, we're going to this restaurant. This restaurant won't serve Black people, so we can't invite you. And so I said something, I don't know what it was. Well, I said something that he could hear, which was, oh, okay. But in my head, like all kinds of words that cannot even be mentioned here, were being like blasted, And then they walked out, and so I sat there with my wife. My wife was with me, and we sat there looking at each other. What happened? So that wasn't so unusual. I would walk into parties and they get double takes. There is that they don't know what to do with a Black artist. That period. Let alone if they can identify it through the work. But with my work, you couldn't identify it, and so it was always like a surprise to people.
Well, I mean, there's that. I'm working on a project with Sam Gilliam, and so there's that same kind of overlap. I mean, with him as an abstract artist, there were a lot of, as an abstract painter, this idea, even though your work is very far apart, there was that expectation, and he was criticized for his abstractions not looking Black or not engaging with the issues that they thought that people expected or thought that a Black artist should respond to. I have one more question, and then we're going to have to close for the evening. This is from someone who's anonymous. Is the repetition of the grid imposed on the single tree a commentary on monoculture and its environmental and conceptual toll?
No.
I mean,
yeah, no, there is a critique to the work, and I just wanted, because I'm just being like a smart ass there, just saying no. That was a good question.
Yeah, no, it's a super, because it makes sense, especially in our current moment, the way we look at them in the starkness of the trees and the way you're talking about species and all the different possibilities within one species.
Yeah, the work is really not about trees.
Yeah.
And it really, the tree becomes a very useful figure for me to create the system. Yeah, because the deciduous tree, the leafless tree can be overlapped, and in that overlap, traces of each tree can be seen. Whereas if the trees have leaves, they would overlap each other and hide what's behind them. And I was really interested in how to produce figures that are not a production of the system, and trees allowed me to do that. The larger critique had to do with representation itself, because the relationship of the systems that I was using to produce the images and the image were clearly arbitrarily related. One had very little relationship to the other in terms of the meaning of a tree. So I'm not focusing on the system, which very easily could be elevated to a critique itself, that the system reinforces the notion of monoculture, which I, as a Black person, have been victimized by. So it could very easily, and that's why I think it's a good question. But I'm hoping that the critique of how art is produced and how and raises also an awareness that certain assumptions that have been used to argue the truthfulness of certain universal principles, that those assumptions are suspect because and completely arbitrary system can produce something that's very meaningful.
Right. Well, it's a nice way to end, since we started with the walnut trees. I just want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know your time is valuable, and I think this has been great from the Hirshhorn audiences. So thank you very much for talking with me this evening.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you. And also, before we close, I just want to say thank you to Janice and Claire for their assistance with the interpretation and captioning this evening. And I'd also like to thank Rebecca and Maria from the Hirshhorn team, who always make sure that all the logistics go well. Technology is tricky, we've all learned over the last year. And finally, thanks to all of our audiences for tuning in. We appreciate your keeping the Hirshhorn in your mind as we move forward. So please join us again next Wednesday, March 24th, when Betsy Johnson will be in conversation with Michelle Stewart. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Good night.